Welcome to the Shutter Sport Podcast, your home for sports news at every level. I'm your host, Katie LeBoutillier, and today I'm joined by resident junior hockey knower Clint Householder and special guest Dylan Baker.
Hi, guys. Good to be here.
Hi, guys. Also good to be here.
Today, we are going to be taking you through the biggest moves of the CHL Trade Deadline and giving some updated power rankings on who we think are Memorial Cup contenders.
From the little leagues to the pros.
This is your weekly sports show. Welcome to the Shutter Sports Podcast.
Take a seat at the table as we discuss.
All right, let's get started in the OHL, and we'll head to the Central Division first. Clint, what went on during the trade deadline there?
Well, there were a lot of teams that tried to load up, especially in the Eastern Conference in general this season, but the Central Division was a big one. There's obviously Barrie, Sudbury, Brampton went in a lot, and then Niagara's also really good. So there's a lot of action. Probably the team that did the most, I would say, is Barrie. At the start of the year, they traded for Wakely. Obviously, they gave up Shamar Moses and a couple picks. He's been a great add so far. And then they completed getting the former North Bay trifecta at the deadline when they traded Weigel and Parker Vaughn in exchange for Owen Van Steensel and Anthony Romani. It's been a tough go of things so far for Barrie. They were really high on the power rankings going into 2025, but they got their first win this past weekend. It took them a little bit of a learning curve, but I think once they get going, it should be a pretty nasty trio, and then they have a lot of depth behind them.
Clint, I got to ask you because I was really curious. Niagara kind of did nothing at the deadline. They stood pat for the most part. They're still sitting in the first in the Central Division, but I expected kind of more from them. What do you think the thought process was there?
Well, I've seen talk from Niagara fans online that they don't really trust their GM. So I saw Niagara fans were happy that they did nothing. I think as good as they are this year, they should be really good next year. I know they traded for some OAs in Van Vliet, but their real core is Kevin He, and then they have Dorchester legend Ryan Rubrick, and they have Max Crete. They have a lot of young guys, Ethan Zada, Brady Waslin. So their real time to contend isn't this year. They should be better in other years. And with so many teams loading up, we'll get into it more, but especially in the Eastern Conference, Barrie loaded up, Sudbury loaded up, Brampton loaded up, Oshawa loaded up, Kingston loaded up, basically 5 teams loaded up, and then there's a couple other teams that are good anyways, like Brantford. So I think it was the right call to not go all in this year. As good as they are doing, they should still be really good next year.
The thing that I struggle with Niagara, Clint, is the fact that they've struggled so much over the past few years. I kind of have a hard time trusting where they're at right now. Are they going to stay in this mix and with not doing really anything at the deadline and kind of standing pat, despite the fact that they did have good success before that? Can they go anywhere in the playoffs? I'm not convinced.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a little bit more of a long shot now. I'll be honest, I didn't think that they were the biggest contender for in the playoffs this year, even with their record. I think if they do anything, that's great for them, and I could see they have a good core, and I could see it happen, but I wouldn't be banking on it. So I think next year, they should be able to really contend. Once, if you look at Oshawa, they're going to be losing Callum Ritchie and a bunch of teams. Brampton's going to be losing half their team. So I think it's smart to not go all in this year and save it for next year, even if you'd hope and you'd see, I know they've struggled as a franchise, so you want to do as much success as you can. But I think even just making the playoffs and being semi-competitive this year is already a stride, and then next year they can really push in and go all in.
I agree. They have a bright future. There's no need to trade everything away this year.
Yeah, plus they don't really have much to trade because mainly these OHL trades are the guy you just took in the first round,
yeah.
And they're not trading Brady Waslin. He's too good to trade. So,
which, going back to Barrie on that, they've traded away their entire future as far as forwards go, Moses and Vaughn going away.
Yeah, they completed the fastest rebuild I've ever seen in my entire life. Last year, they had, or a couple years ago, they had Brant Clark, and then they lost him last year, and they were a pesky 8th seed underdog young team. And then they got Bo Akey back this year from injury. He missed a lot last year, and they just went all in. They got 2 imports in Hemming and Eliason, who were just taking the first and second rounds. And then they got Brad Gardner, who's a former high pick in the NHL to the Stars as well. They got Tristan Bertucci. They loaded up on Stars prospects, but and now they got obviously the North Bay 3. So they went all in this year, which I respect. I think they are maybe the best team in the league this year.
Okay, Clint, I want to ask you about Brampton and the Steelheads, because I don't know about you, but I kind of expected them to do more as well. They kind of made some interesting moves. They got Gillespie from Guelph. I don't know how to say his name.
Braden Gillespie.
They got Gillespie from Guelph, and that was kind of a questionable move just with the way that he had struggled this season. What did you think of Brampton's deadline?
I think They definitely overpaid. I'll be completely honest. I think they definitely overpaid. They gave up a lot for an overager in Connor Smith. They gave up a lot for a goaltender in a down year in Braden Gillespie. And then I think they gave up a decent amount for an import in Ulrichsen. But I think it's hard to argue that the ads don't make sense. Like, I think they all make sense. They just maybe paid too much. I still think they had a good deadline. Like, their penalty kill has been a huge area for improvement this year. Like, they're second last in the entire league, and that's just not good enough when you go into the season as the number 2 team ranked in the entire CHL. So they needed to like shore up that defense. So I get the Connor Smith ad. I think it makes sense. He should help out with that. He's like 6'6", super physical. And they kind of had an import spot. They went into the year with only 2 in Sova and Leskovar, who was injured for most of the year, but then they got Lefebvre, but then they cut him to make room for Smith. But I think Smith's been pretty solid so far, at least defensively. Gillespie, I think definitely a down year. Hasn't been great this year, but I mean Guelph in general has been pretty tough. It's hard to stop pucks there. Like Colin Ellsworth, they're like 2nd or 3rd round pick, I think, in this most recent draft. He's a goalie. He got his first win like a couple weeks ago. Like, it's just been a tough go of things for Guelph, so I wouldn't like discourage his stats too much. I think he's looked all right so far in Brampton, and Ulrichsen I think has looked great. So.
Yeah, and then one more thing in the Central that I want to touch on. We'll kind of come back to it when we get to Ottawa, but Muse to Sudbury was a very interesting trade, more so from the Ottawa side. But
I think it is an utterly fantastic deal for Sudbury. Like,
yeah.
I am a fan of the Steelheads, and I remember talking to my brother coming home from one of the games. We had like a 2-hour drive home, and I was telling him how badly I think the Steelheads could use Henry Muse. And I was like, I would give up every pick that we have to get him. He is just a truly like dynamic, game-breaking offensive talent in the blue line. Like, he's arguably been as good or better than like Zane Perrick if you consider like who he has to play with. He doesn't have a Michael Misa. He has a Luca Pinelli. And no disrespect to Luca Pinelli. I love Luca Pinelli. He's an underrated prospect, but like Michael Misa is going to go like top 4, maybe even top 1 this year. So he's just outstanding. So I think great value for Sudbury. They didn't even have to give up the guy that they just took in the first round. They only gave up 2nd round picks, which they got for like trading away like some guys in the deadline to Flint, which I think they did really well in. And they proved themselves right. They told Quentin Mussey they weren't going to trade him because they believe they can contend with him, and I think they have established that now.
So then we'll head on over to the East, where you've been saying that's kind of where all the action happened. Take us through that one.
Well, I mean, the team that went into the season as probably the top team in the East Division, I think they have solidified themselves as in that position in the Oshawa Generals. They obviously went to the finals last year, and then at the start of the season, they traded David Bedkowski and Tristan Delisle to Owen Sound in exchange for Colby Barlow, who I think has looked pretty good. Not as like game-breaking as I thought he would look there, especially with such a great playmaker like Beckett Seneca. But then at this deadline, they made a big move to get Andrew Gibson. I was a little worried before. There were some rumors that they were going to trade Owen Griffin and Brady Smith for Gibson, which I would not have done, but they just did Brady Smith, which I think is fine because he was like sheltered there anyways. He didn't have that much opportunity to thrive this year, like such an old and team that's going for it. And then they also got another surprise addition when they signed Noah Powell from the NCAA. He's a Flyers draft pick, and he's looked good so far. I know he got his first goal in I think it was his first or second game this past weekend. So they did a really good job. They went into it as a top team, and they established that.
In the East Division, Kingston sitting in 2nd place right now. I'm not as much of a savant about junior hockey like you are, Clint, but coming into the year, I didn't really know what to expect from the Fronts, and they've had a really solid season. Why do you think they've been so good?
I think just the emergence of Jacob Battaglia, he is phenomenal. He was a Flames draft pick this past year, and I watched him a couple times, and his speed is just game-breaking. He's really good. They also have 2 of the best imports in the entire OHL in Emil Pieni-Niemi and Tuomas Uronen. They were both great. I think they lead imports in scoring, at least for Finns. At least at the time of the World Juniors when they left. They both played great, helped Finland secure a silver medal, and they had some young guys break out like Tyler Hopkins, and just a solid team as a whole.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And at the deadline, what do they kind of do to supplement that?
I think they had a really questionable deadline. I'm not going to lie. I think they have a lot of young guys. Like Battaglia will be here next year. You don't know about Uronen or Pieni-Niemi. They could come back as OAs, and import slots are always harder to tell who's going to come back because they are both NHL drafted and could go to the American Hockey League as soon as next year. But they traded a metric butt ton of picks at the deadline for some depth guys. No disrespect to Ethan Hay or Joey Willis or Will Bishop, but I don't think those are game-breaking players. And they gave up 18 picks and 2 young guys. That is an insane haul of picks, and I think they're pretty good, and I could see them making noise in the playoffs, but with just such a loaded Eastern Conference, like you're going to have to beat like two of Barrie, Brampton, Oshawa, all these teams, and then you're going to have to go to the finals and play either like London, Windsor, or Kitchener. Like I wouldn't bet on Kingston doing that, so I think it's just a lot of their future to leverage for this season, in my opinion.
Do you think those guys that they got like help them beat Oshawa at all? Because to me, the way I look at it as kind of an outsider, like I said, you're more of an expert than I am. Like to me, Oshawa is the team to beat in the entire Eastern Conference, right? Like does Kingston now, with that, do you think they have a shot to keep it close against Oshawa, or is Oshawa kind of going to run away with the conference?
I don't know. I'm more like scared of Barrie than Oshawa right now. I think Oshawa has higher top end talent, but Barrie's just like so deep. I think Barrie like matches up very well against Kingston because I think they are just better Kingston. Like I think they're both teams are like built on like depth, and they have like some stars, but they can roll three lines, they can run 2D pairs, and they have a solid goaltender. But I just think like Hildebrandt's better than Schenkel, and I think like the Barrie D-core is loaded. I think they have 4 guys that are either NHL drafted or about to go in the first round. Then their forward core is just loaded with either good overagers or guys that are drafted the NHL. So I would just take them in that battle. And I think they match up really well against Kingston. I think they do kind of everything better than Kingston. So I don't think they're going to beat Barrie. Oshawa, I think, can just overpower them with like the dynamic duo of Richie and Seneca. Like that is maybe the best duo in the entire, I'll say OHL, because once we get to the WHL, there's one more duo that I'd like to talk about. But yeah.
Yeah, I think too, Barrie's kind of built like a playoff team now. Like they're just gritty and they're deep, and I think they have a chance at going pretty far in this playoff run.
Yeah, and they're so big and like physical.
Yeah,
like
Atchison.
Atchison is the meanest guy I've ever seen play hockey, and I mean that in a good way. Like this guy is always looking to hurt you. And like they also have Eliason, who's like I think near the top of the league in penalty minutes. Like he's a bit of a goon, but like they're gonna wear you down, and like all their forwards are experienced. They're gonna wear you down. So they're a tough team to meet in the playoffs.
And then we'll touch quickly on Brantford, kind of sitting at the middle of the pack there. What all did they do this deadline?
They had like a really weird deadline. All they really did was trade away Noah Roberts to Sudbury, and they got a great haul for him. I think they got a great return for him, and then they traded for Budnick from Guelph. So I think they did improve like a little bit. But it's just a weird deadline. Like I think they could have sold off if they're not gonna go in this year. They could have sold off some guys and think got high returns. Like Lardis is phenomenal. They have Van Acker and O'Brien for next year, so I kind of understand not wanting to go all in, especially if they think they're gonna keep Juracek for next year. But it's just really weird to not like trade Lardis and try and like make next year their year, like I think Niagara is doing.
And then Ottawa, Peterborough rounding out the division there. Not much going on.
Yeah, can I talk about Ottawa for a second? Because I think they have had the most disastrous year of anyone in the entire CHL. Like I don't think anything has gone well for them, and I feel bad for them. I know their general manager is like trying to do right by their players. Like he made sure all their overagers had homes in the OHL when they traded away Stonehouse, but they just had a really tough year. Like in the offseason, they traded away Tuomas Urinen to Kingston for like nothing. They got like a 6th round pick back, and he has been like phenomenal, over a point per game this year. And then they traded away Gardner to Barrie, and Gardner's been pretty good there, pretty solid there. And then now at the deadline, they didn't trade Pinelli, and they traded Muse. I don't think they even got that good of a return on Muse, but the reason why they had to trade him is because he's going to the NCAA next year. So like it was really weird, and possibly the reason for that is because of like the disastrous World Juniors with Dave Cameron. Like I know he got a lot of the blame, a lot of hate, whether you think it's justified or not. A lot of people did hate him after that, and there's rumors I saw like swirling around from some OHL insiders that the reason why they had such a poor deadline of like not being able to trade Pinelli and getting a low return on Muse is because players were refusing to waive their no move clause to go there. So that is just like nightmare scenario for Ottawa. Like if they went like going into the year, they trade away guys and like, okay, we're going to sell. And then at the deadline, they couldn't even sell like one of their more valuable pieces, and then they sold low on the other one. I would be higher on the deadline if they also traded Pinelli. Like I don't see the point in getting rid of Muse if you're going to keep Pinelli. Like I think Pinelli's probably going to like the AHL or ECHL next year. There's a chance they maybe keep him, but it's still just a chance. And even if they do keep him next year, if they try and trade him, he's not going to get that much because he's an overager and teams like have their slots filled. And then also, like, I don't think they'll be good next year. So it's just a really weird offseason. Like, if they kept Gardner and Urinen and Muse, I think they could actually be decent. Like, they could be in the same boat as, like, Brantford, but they just kind of did everything weird this offseason. Or this season, really.
Yeah. And then Peterborough was kind of not even worth the...
Yeah, I mean, like, they just got Stonehouse. People hated that move, but, like, I don't know. When you have a really young team, like, they got a bunch of guys. Last year they had a huge sell-off. They got like Caden Taylor. They got a ton of guys that were just taken in the first round, and it's not really been like meshing the best this season. Like they got a really young team, and I think it's a good idea to get a veteran in Stonehouse. And like in the OHL, you can't sign free agents. So like if you're gonna get a veteran, you kind of need to trade for him. And they barely gave up anything to get him. So I've seen Pete fans hating that move. I think it's a good move. He's an NHL draft, or he's an NHL signed prospect that can help these young guys like transition to the OHL and like get their footing. So I think it's a pretty decent move.
Brady Stonehouse suited up in a few games for the Kamoka Kings of the Greater Ontario Junior Hockey League as well.
Thank you, Dylan. I love the Kings. So.
Yeah.
All right, and then moving on to the division you'll probably have the most to talk about because it features the London Knights. Everyone buckle up because here's the Midwest division.
I mean, I feel like we should take it away with the division leading and OHL leading London Knights. They are just a wagon. I think they got better at the deadline. Their move was earlier when they traded for Cam Allen. I was a little surprised that they went with a more offensive-minded defenseman than a defensive-minded D with like already having Bonk, who's good at offense, and then they also have Dickinson, who's very good at offense. So I was a little surprised to see that move, but it made sense at the time because both of those two guys that I mentioned were playing for Canada at the World Juniors. So they were gone. They needed someone to run the top power play unit when they were like away, and I think Allen's very good at that. And I don't think they paid like a crazy price for him, and I do still think he makes their team better even now that those guys are back.
Yeah. I'm with you on that. Like, I think London right now is the team to beat in the Ontario Hockey League. I don't think that's a very bold take to be saying that out there. Like, they were obviously in the Memorial Cup last year, came oh so close to winning it, lost it in the final minute to Saginaw. I think this team has come back this year with a vengeance, right? Like, they've come back saying, we want to make it all the way this season because of the way that they lost. It was a heartbreaking finish, but if you'll remember that Memorial Cup final, like, they weren't good for the first half of that game. They had, I think, 6 shots through the first 40 minutes or something crazy like that. They didn't have a very good performance in that game, and I think they've kind of carried that over and really come back this season with extra energy and even more motivation to win it all.
Yeah, like, and on that loss specifically, like I was there in Saginaw with my London Knights jersey on, cheering them on, and like I think they had a disastrous start. I think especially some of their star players were quiet. I think that they were trying a little bit too much, like Cowan and Barkey and them. And I think this year, like they've shown, like they're coming in this year, they need to prove that they are top players. And they have. Like Cowan has got a point in every single game he's played this year. Barkey's been phenomenal. Like I think he had like 18 points in 3 games the other weekend. Like he is nuts. And then they also somehow managed to get one of the best goalies in the league, Austin Elliott, from like a WHL waiver. Really weird that like Barry helped them do that, but he hasn't lost a single game this year. He was 3-0 in Saskatoon, and then now he comes over and he is undefeated with London. They're just a wagon. Their last 10 games, they're 9-0-1. Just phenomenal team.
Yeah.
Going back to the Cam Allen trade really quick, I like that they just like picked him up at a gas station on the side of the road.
That was so
That's
funny.
my favorite part of that trade.
And like they showed the bus video, and everyone's like, yeah.
Like high-fiving everyone.
It was great.
Yeah, they're a really close-knit group, it seems. Like, everybody seems to
yeah.
fit in there. Everybody seems to be well-liked in that room, and Cam Allen seemed right away, like you mentioned, to slot in perfectly.
Yeah, and that trio of Barkey, Bonk, and Cowan is like just my favorite thing.
Yeah.
It's so funny.
And they just keep getting guys. Like, they just seem to spawn guys out of nowhere. Like they were good. They were great last year. It's like, oh, we got another new import in Jesse Nurmi, who's NHL drafted and a beast. And then they just randomly signed Blake Montgomery, who's just a stud. And like I think he's around a point per game. And then like Will Nickel, I was at the Mem Cup last year. I think I saw him play maybe a combined 6 minutes in like the 3 games that I was at. This year he's like point per game and a stud. Like they're so good at developing guys. They put them in situations where they're going to succeed, and it's just you see it year in and year out.
I don't mean to be a GOJHL truther here with the Greater Ontario Junior Hockey League, but the Knights have a pipeline there where they can send these guys to these teams. They've got so many teams in and around London. Will Nickel, who you just mentioned, St. Thomas Star in the GOJHL.
I think he was a rookie of the year when he played in the
Sam
Gouge.
O'Reilly, London National. Easton Cowan, Kamoka King, right? Oliver Bonk, St. Thomas Star, right? So they have these teams that they can send these guys to in so many different opportunities, right? Where they're not going to get forced out to the outside and they can play big minutes in big situations. I know from experience when Cowan was in Kamoka, he was playing power play time, he was playing penalty kill time, he was playing on the first line, he was getting crazy minutes game in, game out, which allowed him a lot of opportunity to develop, which some other teams may not be able to afford that, right? Because they may not have as many teams in and around the area where they're located. And so I think that's a big benefit for London, and it's part of the reason that they churn out such a successful pipeline of players.
Yeah, they're phenomenal. And like a new one is Logan Hari, who they had this year. I think he looked good in the sheltered role he played in London. They sent him down to the Goge. First game, 4 goals in a win. I don't know who they were playing against in that game, but it's just a phenomenal game from Hari.
They were playing the Kamoka Kings in that game, Clint. It was a tough one for the Kamoka Kings in that contest.
Yeah.
Dylan, if you don't know, is the play-by-play for the Kamoka Kings.
Yeah, I was at that game, and Logan Howery was every bit as good as advertised. I mean, that guy is phenomenal. He's actually the first ever first-round pick to play in that league, OHL first-round pick to play in that league in his 16-year-old season. And that just speaks to the depth the Knights have, right? You have a guy like Logan Howery, who we both agree was pretty good in his sheltered role with the Knights, but they didn't even have that sheltered role to offer him to continue to develop because they've got so much depth, because they've got so much experience on the team. They felt they were better served sending Howery to the GOJHL mid-season so that he could get more ice time because they didn't have room for their first-round pick on the roster. That just speaks to how deep this team is.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Moving on from the London Knights, although we could talk about them all day. The Kitchener Rangers, they're obviously not as much of a powerhouse, but they're kind of right there behind the Knights. What's going on with them?
They've just had like a stellar season of everyone is performing. Like, if you look at them, they don't have like the London Knights like Easton Cowan or like superstars like that, but everyone on the team is good. Like they've just gotten so many guys this year. Like they randomly signed Jack Pridham out of I think it was the BCHL, and he's just been phenomenal in the OHL. They just recently got Christian Humphreys, who is playing for Michigan this year, and then he decommitted mid-season to join Kitchener, and he's been great in a short term. He hasn't been there for too long, but he looked great. I saw him last weekend. He looked pretty darn good. And their overagers have just been phenomenal. Like Misseljevic has been great, and Jackson Parsons in net has been by far the best goaltender in all of the OHL. He's just stellar. Like he keeps them in games. I was at the game in Brampton on the weekend, and they ended up losing, but you can't fault him for any of the goals that were scored, and he saved like 3 more diving across glove saves. It's like, this guy's just so good.
Okay, moving on. Erie Otters, Owen Sound, Guelph Storm. We've kind of touched on Guelph a little bit and Owen Sound, but what's happening over there?
Owen Sound, I think Owen Sound had a great deadline. I mentioned in the Brampton one how I think Brampton overpaid for Connor Smith. I think Owen Sound got a phenomenal haul for Connor Smith. I said Owen Smith. For Connor Smith. Connor Smith, they got a great haul for him. And they had a really weird trade with Flint, who traded for Sam McHugh, and they gave up Cole Zarowski, who I believe was the 6th pick in last year's OHL entry draft. And Owen Sound had to give up a couple picks to make that deal go through. But I think they did phenomenal. Like whenever you can add a young talent like Zarowski, who just went that highly and is having a good rookie season, for a guy that's not going to play for you after this year, that's just a great move. Really confusing move for Flint. We'll get to that when we talk about the West Division. But I think they did great. Now they have Mbuyi and they have Zarowski to go for in the future. They're going to be a bottom team this year. I think they're second last in the entire Midwest right now and second last in the West Division, so they'll be top 4. They'll guarantee get a top 4 pick. With the lottery, they can move up to 1. So I think they have a great future coming.
Were you surprised they didn't trade Carter George?
No, because he's in 06. Like he'll be back next year. Like there's no chance the Kings are going to take him to the NHL next year. So as long as he's not going to college, which I'm sure they had those discussions with him, like, are you going to go to the NCAA next year? And I think he said no. As long as he's there next year, he can help them contend. Like I think Mbuyi and Zarowski are really good if they get some veterans. If they're like rookie is really good. I could see them being in a spot where they're like the Niagara next year, if like they're better than you expect. So I understand keeping George, and then even if they suck next year, then they can trade George for a haul. And also like this year, not many teams needed goalies. Like when you think about it, like in the East, like or in the West, like maybe London could have made a push for George, but like what are they giving up? Like maybe Hari. I don't know if he would have gone to Owen Sound, because I remember in the draft process he had said he was going to go and play in college hockey, and then the Knights drafted him and he signed there because they're just such a successful franchise. But like a lot of teams had their goaltending position set, so they probably weren't going to get the haul that they would desire if you're trading George. So
I think London would have made a play for George if they didn't get Austin Elliott, right? And with the success that he's had, you know, they didn't really need Carter George in that spot, right? They would have split the net between him and Elliott, and they would have had a really great tandem, but was it worth giving up assets to get Carter George? I don't think so. So, yeah, you know, I wasn't really overly surprised that they didn't trade him, but I wanted to get your thoughts on it, too.
Yeah, especially with London. Like, they have Medvedev, too, who's, like, one of the better goaltending prospects in this year's NHL draft, and he'll be there next year and probably the year after that. So, like, they didn't really need a goalie. Yeah. Like we thought they did.
Medvedev, weird number guy, 78.
Yeah, he's
78. Back when he played in the GOJHL last year with St. Thomas, another GOJHL guy, he wore number 7 as a goalie. Like, just strange numbers for Medvedev. I love it.
Yeah, and I think he's got some like weird pad setups too. Like I remember at the start of the year, I don't know if he still has it, but like everything's white except his blocker was black. Like I love that. Like this guy's just he doesn't follow trends. He's a trendsetter.
I love it. I love it. It's great.
Okay, moving on to the Erie Otters. I haven't heard much about this. What'd they even do?
I don't know if they did anything.
Yeah,
like
that's
there was rumblings that they were maybe going to trade Carey Terrence, and then that never happened. They have, I think, bigger concerns right now. We don't have all the information, but their coach is being investigated right now. That's their biggest concern, and especially with Schaefer already hurt. I don't think they were a true contender in the West this year. That's very unfortunate for them that the Schaefer injury happened when it did, so they don't even know when they'll get him back, if he'd be back for playoffs. So you can't really justify trading a haul of assets on a what if, but it sucks for them because Terrence is his draft year +2, probably his last year with them. They have a good OA core and Panophemus in them, so it's a tough spot for them because they could have been good this year, but that injury really derailed them.
Do you think that injury is the reason they didn't make more of a play at the deadline?
I think so, because I think I watched Schaefer when he came back. I had the opportunity to see him in Brampton one time, and I saw him I forget which game they were playing against, but I watched him. He is so good. When he has the puck on his stick, he's just so dynamic. His skating ability is phenomenal. And when they had him, they were a completely different team. They were okay before they got him, and then in the stretch that they had him, they played phenomenal. They were beating some of the top teams. And then after he got hurt, they've kind of regressed back to being just kind of meh. And when you're just kind of meh, you can't really go all in at the deadline when you have London in your conference.
I know we're going to talk about the West Division in a second, but it feels like the whole Western Conference is a little bit meh. You compare some of the winning percentages to the East. You look at the Central Division. 4 of the teams are over 500 in that division in terms of points percentage. You look at the East Division. 3 of the teams are over 600 in terms of points percentage. And then you look at the West, and you've got London, who's a powerhouse, Kitchener, who's done really well this year, up in that powerhouse conversation, Windsor as well, Saginaw, and Erie, and that's the extent of the teams that are over 500 in terms of points percentage. So it feels like there's, a lot of teams that are not quite, to me at least, real playoff pushing teams. There's a lot of teams under 500 in the Western Conference.
Yeah, it's a really uncharacteristic year for the Western Conference. They are clearly the weaker year this year. Aside from London and Windsor, those are the only 2 teams I'd really bank on to win the entire OHL. I think Kitchener's solid, and I don't mean to discredit what they've done, but they're just they got a really young core besides their overagers, and I don't know if they have the star talent to keep up with a London. We'll see. I think they play on Tuesday night. We'll see how they can do in that game. I think London's taken the previous matchups this season. But it's just a really weird year. No one is really that good. I think there was a lot of teams that went all in last year. Saginaw obviously was a Mem Cup host. They ended up winning the Memorial Cup. They went all in. Last year, Kitchener had Rakoff, and they had Brustovitz, and they had Sop, who was their captain and overager, and they don't anymore. So a lot of these teams just lost guys from last year. So I think a lot of them have taken steps back, and only really Windsor was the one team that I thought in the preseason would take a step forward, and they really have. Green Tree's been phenomenal, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for these teams to go all in when you don't really have the pieces yet. You're a young team, so
yeah. And we talked about Guelph a little bit earlier. They're selling this deadline.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't even do that much. I think they got good returns on Ulrichsen and Gillespie, and then they got an okay return on Budnick. They chose to keep Lachenko, which I understand because I think they got McLean in the first round last year. I think he's looked pretty solid. They have Ellsworth. I think they could be decent next year, especially in a weaker conference. You don't I think London will still be good, but there's no guarantees. And then besides that, it's kind of a crapshoot. Misa might be going to the college. You don't even know what's going on in that conference. So I understand them keeping him and maybe either making a push next year or really selling him next year.
I think you keep Jet Lachenko just for the name, to be honest.
Yeah, he's just sick. He's so good. I thought he was really underrated at the World Juniors.
Yeah.
Good name, London, Ontario guy. Big ups, Chad Lachenko.
Junior Ice legend.
Okay, and then rounding off the OHL with the West Division. Let's get into it.
Yeah, Windsor, they're the top team in this division. I think they were going into it, and I think they still are. They didn't really do much. They got McNamara, and then they got Kennedy from North Bay, so they just kind of got some depth guys. I think it was the right move for them. As good as they are this year, they have a lot of guys that will be coming back. Green Tree will be there next year. Protus will probably be there next year. There's a chance he goes to the AHL, but I think he'll probably be back. They just got Belchets in the first round, who is the first overall, who's phenomenal. I watched him with the OHL Cup, the puck on his stick. You don't see many big men move like he does. I'm terrified to see what he'll do in the playoffs, when he's in his prime of the OHL. Then they also got Jean-Christophe Lemieux in the second round, who has looked great, and even Carter Hicks. So I think they got a young core. They should be good for a little while here. So I think it makes sense for them to not go all in, and I think the moves that they did make were solid, and I think they are still a little bit of a better team than they were before the deadline.
Yeah, and then we were saying, it kind of drops off right after that.
Yeah, they're the only team in the West, the West Division this year that's really going to do anything. Saginaw, they were the next best team, and then they sold at the deadline. Like, it's just the Misa, Perrick, and Epperson show, basically. Harmer's been really good. Cloutier's been good, but they traded away Hay, Willis, like we already mentioned, that trade for Kingston. I think they did a really good job after giving up a ton of their assets last year to be good and go to the Mem Cup finals and win that. They emptied the cupboards. I think they did a great job refilling. Like I mentioned, they got a ton of picks from Kingston and some decent young guys like Ethan Wire, London legend. And I think that it's a good rebuilding year. I was wondering if they would like maybe move Perek or Misa, because we saw the rumblings of Misa going to college. I think it was the right move to not trade him. I think him being named captain makes me optimistic that he will stay in the OHL next year. And as long as they have him and Perek together, then they should be really good next year.
Yeah, and then Flint, you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, Flint, just a really weird deadline. Like, they weren't that good, and like they in no way to me does the trading for Sam McHugh make them better than the London Knights. Like, I don't get the point in giving up your 6th overall pick to get him. It's just a really weird year. Like, if they didn't have to lose Bertucci, who requested a trade in the offseason, if they didn't have to lose him, then I could see, like, I could understand it more, because then they'd have, like, that dynamic power play quarterback. But their power play is horrible. Like, it's at, I think, like, 11%, something like that. They are really bad on the power play, and good teams aren't bad on the power play. Like, you have to be good on special teams, and I don't think McHugh is going to change that. And especially when you're going up against the London Knights that can click at, like, around 30%, that's just not going to happen, you know?
They weren't that good before the deal, and they're not that good after the deal. Like, it was just, I don't understand it myself. Like, they're 2-6-2 over their last 10 games. I don't know. Like, I had a really hard time with Flint's deadline.
Like, I think it was just, they went kind of all in the offseason. Like, they made a ton of moves. They got a bunch of the older guys that Sudbury was forced to lose in, like Mania and them and like Kanyan. And then they traded for Christopher Thibodeau. And I think they were just like sticking to their guns, like, well, you know, we already tried. You know, we already gave up a bunch of picks, so might as well keep going.
Just sell them.
I know. That's what I agree. Like, they could have traded Thibodeau. I don't think the overagers could have gone, but like, I think I would have like looked to retool. I think the deal makes no sense. Like, I could rant about it for a while here, but I think a phenomenal job by Owen Sound to recognize that they were in that position. Also, it was really weird when they traded for McHugh. There was like reports that he wasn't going to show up. Hilarious. Like, trading for a guy that didn't even want to go there. I don't know how true that is, but I saw it reported in a lot of spots from the insiders that I was like getting the trade information from before it happened. So yeah, just a yikes deadline for the Firebirds.
To be fair, who wants to go to Flint? But.
Yeah, especially like if you're like, I'm going to get traded to a contender at the OHL trade deadline. You get traded to Flint this year. It's kind of like, oh man, you know, like I could have gone to London here, or could have gone to like anyone in the East. Like, oh.
And then Sarnia and Sioux, really not much happening.
Yeah, Sarnia, I don't even know what they did at this deadline. Like, they made a minor trade with North Bay, and they like did a couple like small tweaks like that. But I think it's the right move. Like, they were a young team. They had nothing really to sell. Like, maybe they could have sold Fisher, but I don't think it makes sense, because I think they could be pretty good next year. Like, I think the rookies have looked good as well, and like Diorio and them. Edwards has been great. So I think it made sense for them. Maybe they could have traded an overager, but there just wasn't that much of a market for it. And then similarly with Sault Ste. Marie, I think they did great in the Gibson trade. Like, Brady Smith, who they now have a combination of Brady T. Smith and Brady R. Smith, who wear numbers 11 and 12 and play on the same line. Announcer's nightmare, I think, or
yes,
play-by-play guy's nightmare.
correct.
I think you could talk about that, but I think that they did a great trade. He was one of the top goal scorers in the GTHL last year, and he's had a decent start there in Sault Ste. Marie. I think he'll prove to be a good piece long term. I was a little confused that they didn't trade, or I was like, half expecting them to trade like Allard at the deadline and maybe Noel Nord, but they didn't move them. There wasn't much of a market for an overager, and there's never really a huge market for imports, so I think it made sense that they didn't, but I was maybe hoping that they would and like fully rebuilt. But I think they can be really pesky next year.
Quickly on Sarnia, Beckham Edwards, Kamoka legend from Kamoka, Ontario.
Yeah.
Shout out Kamoka.
Yeah.
Hey, Sioux Greyhounds. Shout out Spencer Evans, Stittsville native.
Wow.
Ooh.
Okay. And that kind of rounds out the OHL. Any final thoughts on Ontario hockey?
Clint, I want your prediction on who's going to win it all.
I'm trying not to be biased. Like, I'm from London. I'm trying not to be biased and just say London. But I feel like they have an easier path than any of the teams from the Eastern Conference. Like, the Eastern Conference, there's just too many contenders. Like, if you're Oshawa or Niagara or Brampton or Ottawa, Sudbury, or like any of those teams, Kingston, like you're going to have to beat each other. You're going to have to at least beat 2 or 3 of those teams to even get to the finals. And then for London, it's like, okay, cool. Right now they have Sault Ste. Marie in the first round, who we just talked about as a seller. It's like, okay, you beat Sault Ste. Marie. And then the next round, it's like, okay, you're playing Flint or Saginaw, who I think they would easily dismantle. Then it's finally in the Western Conference Finals, then you're playing against like Windsor or Kitchener. So I'd probably go London. Dark horse team, I think Windsor has a really good shot. Like they have a lot of big bodies that I could see being like playoff beasts. I already mentioned Belchet's, like Greentree's a big boy. Nesbitt's pretty big. Like I think they could be a little underrated. I think that's the one team I would keep an eye on.
I'm hoping for Barrie. It's one of their last shots, and they really went all in. So
yeah,
I could see them being a good playoff team.
A good year for sellers. That's just my last point. I think a lot of the sellers did really well in getting some very talented pieces.
All right. Moving on to the WHL, we'll start it off in the East again. Honestly, you're going to have to take kind of the lead here, Clint, because I don't know which teams did what.
Yeah, it was really weird. The team that was in first in the Eastern Division was Saskatoon, and they sold. Like, they traded Molendyke, they traded Lazowski. I think it was the right move. Like, last year, they were kind of all in with Suzdalev and Minton. It didn't end up working out for them. Obviously, it sucks if you're a fan base to see your team being really good and then still trading away at the deadline. But I don't know. I think they got like pretty decent hauls for those guys, and I think it was right to kind of look for the future. Like with how many teams are good in the rest of the Eastern Conference, I don't think the East Division is great, but the Central Division is very good. Teams were loading up galore in there, and then the West, it's really good. So I think it made sense. Like I think they weren't going to win in the final, so I think it's just better to look to the future.
Yeah, if you look at like they're barely over 500 and they're leading that division, so it kind of makes sense. Like that is not the strongest division.
Yeah, Prince Albert's been pretty good though. They had Mercic and they got Dragicevic in the offseason, and I think they've both looked pretty good. Like when the deal happened, the Mercic for Richie swap, I think everyone thought that they were on the losing end of that. I think everyone thought Richie would do phenomenal in Medicine Hat, but he's been kind of slow, and Mercic has been great. So I think they've done a really good job, like kind of quickly retooling here and establishing themselves as like at least a playoff contender. I don't know if they'll make much noise in those playoffs, but I think they're like a solid playoff team. Swift Current, I don't really think they did that much of the deadline. Moose Jaw, I think they did a good job selling off. They traded Jaeger. They got some of the picks back, because last year they traded for Savoy. They went all in. They had to recoup some of those assets. I think they did a good job. I'd be interested to see what they do with Lyndon Lakovic in the offseason / like next year's deadline. They're a team to keep an eye on, to keep trading. There are a couple like great talents in the upcoming WHL draft. So I think it's like good to try and get one of those guys.
I'm always rooting for Moose Jaw. I think what it meant to the community last year to see them win the WHL and go on to the Memorial Cup, I've always got a soft spot in my heart for the Moose Jaw Warriors, so I hope they do well.
Also, I think they have like the coolest branding in all of the CHL. Like their logo is like a snowbird. It is so sick. Like they did a phenomenal job. Because I remember their old one, like they changed it because it was a little controversial, but they just did like a stellar job in the rebrand. So good for Moose Jaw. I always cheer for Moose Jaw.
Yeah, and then anything for Brandon Wheat Kings or the Regina Pats.
Brandon made a big move. They swapped Charlie Ellick for Jordan Gavin. I think they needed some forward help, so I think that kind of made sense. They have Bjarnson. They have a great goaltender. They could be a sneaky team. I said team sleepy, as in like they could be slept on. Roger McQueen has been out with injury for the past while. If he comes back and can replicate the production he had at the start of the year, I think they're a team to keep an eye on. They're maybe the team I'd be most worried about in this East Division, just because they have a great goaltender. If Roger McQueen can come back, they have Jackson Jacobson. I think they could make some sneaky noise.
Most worried about overall, or most worried about as a sleeper in the division?
Most worried about overall in the division, to be honest. Like if McQueen can come back, like he's pushing for top 5 in this year's NHL draft. I think he's got a lot to establish. I think you can see him having a really big year. And he's one of those. I was talking about the big guys in the OHL. He is huge. He's like 6'5", 6'6". Like he could be a real playoff beast.
And then anything from Regina.
They had like a really weird deadline as well. They suspended one of their players, and then that player had a brother also on the team, and then both of them requested trades, which was really weird. I think they got them. Yeah, the Vaughns. I think they got a good return for Jackson Vaughn. They got a first round pick for him, and they got back a player that I don't think is even like that much worse than Vaughn. So I think they did really good there. And then they sold off Tanner Howe to Calgary, and I think they did pretty solid there. They got a first round pick, and they got Reese Hamilton, who was like a former WHL first round pick. I think there's like some untapped potential there. He hasn't been like stellar since he got to Regina, but I think it makes sense. Like Howe was in his last year with the club, so get a younger guy and get a first round pick. So I actually think they did pretty well as a seller as well.
Yeah, Yeah, they're definitely in a rebuild. Like, that's kind of the last of that core that was there with Bedard, and they're fully, like, new team now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the East. Moving on to the Central, like we were saying, a little bit more of a competitive division here.
Yeah, a bit of a bloodbath. Starting up top, they got Medicine Hat right now. They obviously made maybe the big, I'll say second biggest move, because there's one bigger move that I'd talk about in the West. But they got Molendyke from Saskatoon. I don't even think they gave up like an insane haul for him. I think it was pretty reasonable. After they missed out on the Mem Cup bid for next year, I think it just made sense for them to go all in, because they have like Gavin McKenna, Lindstrom if he comes back from his injury and could be great. They have Basha, they have the Ruck twins, and they already had like a decent blue line. So I think they have Richie, who I mentioned earlier, who hasn't performed as good as I expected, but he's still been like pretty solid. I think there's more room for him to grow there. Going into the year, they were ranked in the top 10 of the entire CHL. And I think they didn't fully hit that potential, in part due to some injuries. But I think they are the team that I'd maybe be most worried about in this conference. They're pretty scary if they're fully healthy. Like if Lindstrom can come back and be who he was last year, and you pair him up with McKenna, you get one of the best defensemen in the entire league in Molendyke. They can score a lot of goals.
Okay, then moving on to Calgary.
They also were one of the teams that had a big deadline. Yakimchuk was obviously in his last year because he's in 05, so it made sense for them to like push. I think Kindle and Tulk have been very, very good this year, which has helped allow them to like turn into a contender. And they went all in. They got Tanner Howe. They were the team that traded with Regina there. I think they did pretty good as well. Like I think it's a fair return. I think that was a good hockey trade. Hamilton didn't really have a spot to shine in Calgary, and I think he has more of a chance to do that in Regina. And they got a player who's better for them right now in Tanner Howe. I think that's good. He's been great there. He's a very good two-way guy, like less so like pure offensive talent, but he's a guy that you think would be good in the playoffs due to his like reliability. And then at the back end, they also traded for Sawyer Minio, who is also on Team Canada this year, and he's similar to Howe. Like he's not going to really wow you offensively, but he's stable. So I think and then they also got Hauser from Wenatchee in net. So they established like they're trying to be a playoff team. Like they got better in the crease, they got better at the back end, and they got better at the forward position, and all of them are responsible two ways. So.
Yeah, and I'll just say I'm high on Tanner Howe. Like, I like him. He's a stable guy, like you were saying. He's just a solid player.
Yeah.
A good piece to have, especially if you're looking to go in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think people somewhat underrate that addition because, like, he was kind of miscast with the World Juniors this year, and I don't think people, like, were as pleased with him as they had hoped going into it. But I do still think he's a very good player. I
agree. Anything in Lethbridge?
Yeah, they made some big moves. They were the team that got Braden Yeager. Then they also got Caden Price at the deadline as well. I think going into the year, I didn't really think of them as a contender, so it was a little weird to see them trade for Yeager, but he's been really good there. I think Price is one of the better defensemen in the dub this year. I think they did pretty good. I could very easily see them making some noise. I think they do player polls in the WHL where they'll be like, who do you think's going to win? Who do you think's going to win the regular season? Who do you think's going to be the best player? Who do you think's going to be the toughest team in the postseason? And Lethbridge got a lot of votes by the players that they thought that Lethbridge would be the best team in the East this year, after making those moves. So I think they're maybe a little underrated, at least from me. I think I can admit that I underrated them because I think the players are scared of them. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're right there in the standings, and they're 8-2 in their last 10. Yeah,
they've been buzzing as of late.
They're looking good.
Yeah, them and Medicine have been buzzing as of late. So.
Yeah, and then Edmonton Oil Kings.
Neither the Oil Kings or the Rebels made much noise. I think the Rebels had one 3-team trade that wasn't really a huge blockbuster, and then the Oil Kings didn't do the most either. So
okay, moving on to the BC division. We've got the Victoria Royals sitting in first there at the moment.
Yeah, they had some big moves at the offseason when they got Kenta Isagai and they got Brendan Lazowski. I think both of whom are overagers. Isagai I watched a little bit last year. I watched some of the Wenatchee Wild. I happen to like them. I like their jersey. I think it's fun when teams move. So I was rooting for them. So I watched them last year. I think he's very good. Former USHL champion with Youngstown. It was a bit of a weird fit because he's an import and an overager, so that really limited the market, which allowed Victoria to swoop in and get a player of his talent for a fairly cheap price. So I think he's been good, and since they got him, they're 8-1-0-1 in their past 10. They've been great. I think people going into the year thought Prince George would be the best team in this division, but I think Victoria's looked the best as of late. So I think they had a really good deadline. I think they have Rechny, who's very good. They have some of their good young defensemen like Verhoof, who's been very good. Very impressive in his draft year or draft -1 season. So yeah, they've been great. I think they'll be good next year as well. So I don't even think they gave up like a crazy amount. So very good offseason for Victoria, or midseason for Victoria.
Yeah, and you mentioned Prince George, who are on a bit of a skid at the moment. Not really what they do with the deadline to kind of go. They're 5-5 in their last 10, and I think on a 4-game skid here.
They didn't do the most. Like they're already a pretty good team. Like they had Parashak, they had Riley Height, they had Ravensbergen and net. They didn't do like a whole lot at the deadline. But I still think they're a team I wouldn't want to play in the playoffs. Like going into the year, they were ranked highly for a reason. I think like there's maybe been a little bit more struggles than expected, but I think they're still a very, very tough team, especially when you have such a good goalie in Ravensbergen and net, who was like voted as one of the hardest goalies to score on in those player polls that I previously mentioned. You can't ever count them out in the playoffs.
Well, let's talk about Prince George, Clint.
Well, their big move was trading for Ben Reich. They gave up Hunter Lang, Lucas Dumas, a first-round pick, and a fifth-round pick. And I don't think it's worked out as good as they've hoped. Hunter Lang, I believe, is an NHL draft pick of the Flames. He hasn't been I don't think he's that much of a downgrade from Reich, and they also gave him a first-round pick. So a bit of a weird move, and Reich has not really adjusted like the greatest since coming over. He's put up 3 points in 5 games after putting up 54 and 37 in Saskatoon. So definitely like a little bit of a disappointment there. I think there's time to turn it around. Like sometimes it takes a while after you get traded from like especially so far away from Saskatoon to BC. Like it's a pretty far commute there. So I think maybe in the future, hopefully they'll look for him to find his footing. But I still wouldn't count them out when they have like Riley Height, Tarek Parashak, and they also have Ravensbergen and Ned, who's just phenomenal.
Yeah, and then moving on to the Vancouver Giants.
I hope it was a giant deadline for them.
Vancouver, their big ad was Maxim Muranov, and it was in a bit of a weird trade because they sent Tyson Zimmer back to Wenatchee, who didn't report. He was like, I'm not going there. So they had to like remake the trade and like agree on something to send back in return or in exchange for Zimmer. But they swapped an 04 for an 04. I think they got a little bit better, but I don't think I don't think they're a real contender in the West this year. In their division, I'd probably say that they are definitely still the third best, and the U.S. division has a lot of good teams. So yeah.
They got another Brady Smith. There's another Brady Smith out there, and Vancouver picked him up at the deadline, a goalie. They traded out a goalie. They got a goalie at the deadline, kind of shoring up the goaltending position, I would guess.
Yeah, that's actually the second time that Brady Smith has been traded this year.
One of the three Brady Smiths that we've talked about in the podcast.
Yes, exactly. The third Brady Smith we mentioned in this podcast.
What's his middle name?
He started in Moose Jaw, he started in Lethbridge, got traded in the Moose Jaw trade that we mentioned, the Jaeger one. There was also a goalie swap where they sent Jackson Unger from Moose Jaw to Lethbridge. Smith is still a solid goaltender, so then Moose Jaw had a solid goaltender still, and then they were able to flip him at the deadline to now go to Vancouver, who is now shoring up their goaltending. So it's funny that Brady Smith was traded as a goaltender downgrade and then traded as a goaltender upgrade in the same season. That's pretty funny.
And Jackson Unger related to Brock Badgers legend Connor Unger?
Yes, they're brothers. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, moving on to the Kelowna Rockets.
I think they had a great deadline. I'm going to be honest. They were in a tough spot. They won the Mem Cup bid for next year, but unfortunately, Caden Price and Andrew Cristal are like too old to play in that. They'll be both in the American Hockey League next year, so they were kind of in a tough spot. Kind of luckily though, they're kind of bad this year. Like they kind of struggled. Everyone going into the year thought they were going to be one of the top teams in the entire WHL. Like they were in the CHL top 10 power rankings, but they struggled out of the gate. And then with Iginla being hurt, then it put them in a prime position to trade Cristal and Price, which I think was the right decision. They got Hayden Poppenix, who's been pretty solid since going over to Kelowna. And then that was in the Cristal trade, and then in the Caden Price trade, they got Will Sharp, who is a pretty solid defenseman who's going to go in the NHL draft this year. So they got some guys that'll be there next year, and they got some picks to use at the offseason or next year's deadline. I mentioned earlier that I'm interested to see what Moose Jaw does with Lyndon Lakovic. I think they could be a team that could try and get him in the offseason because he's got one more year left. He's draft eligible this year, but he is an 06, so it'll be his last year next year. And I think they could really use him if they're going to try and load up for the Memorial Cup.
Chris Millett, former head coach of the Kelowna Rockets now, after they let him go throughout the middle of this season, it feels like there's a lot of work to do for Kelowna, just the way that they kind of entered this year. You mentioned some high expectations. They're hosting the Memorial Cup next year, so you want to put a good team out on the ice. What do they have to do to be a real contender at the Memorial Cup in 2026?
Well, I think they have some good pieces. Like Ginla, when he comes back, he should be really good. I think Poppenix that they got back is good. Sharp that I mentioned, he's also pretty solid. They also have like the Gozic brothers in Hiroki and Kanyu, who I think are pretty good. Like Hiroki just went to the Predators in his most recent draft. They also have Levi Benson, who is the younger brother of Zach Benson, who I loved as a prospect. I think he's phenomenal, very underrated in young player discussions. Don't at me, Corey Pronman, but I think those guys can be solid, and they have now some picks to trade. And because they're kind of bad this year, they should have a top pick in this draft. If they get like any lottery luck, then they could get a truly phenomenal player next year. Like a phenomenal player to trade probably, because in the dub, like, you draft a year earlier and you can only like fully make it in your first year if you have like exceptional status. Which I don't think is going to happen for any of the players. But there's like maybe a chance. But I think they'll still get a good player that they could trade, and then they'll have a couple extra first round picks because they traded away Kristall and Price. I think they got to shore up their goaltending. It was a bit of a question mark this year. They released Kikkonen, and then they really weren't able to find a good solution. They got like lit up like 10-0, or it was either 10-0 or 11-0 the other night against Spokane. They have a lot of work to do. I would be really mad if I was one of the other teams like the previously mentioned Spokane, who like also bid for the Mem Cup next year, because I think like if you're looking at it, like it's looking pretty bleak for Kelowna. Like they have a lot of work to do. They could very easily be one of the top teams next year, but I think there's a chance that they're just kind of like mid and then the Memorial Cup host. And if I was like Spokane, who I think is going to be one of the best teams in the entire league next year, I'd be pretty mad.
And then quickly rounding off the BC division, Kamloops.
Yeah, I thought they were going to trade Emmett Finney, but they didn't. I know their coach was like trying to prop him up to try and make Team Canada. He's been great this year. He was a sneaky draft pick of the Detroit Red Wings, and he got signed to an entry-level contract, which is like very rare for a guy drafted that late. He was in the 7th round, I believe. So there's a lot of problems with him. I thought they were going to trade him, but they didn't. They're in a weird spot. Like they don't have the most to trade away, and then they had also like gone all in for Olin Zellweger a couple years ago when they were the hosts, when they had like Logan Stankoven. That really did not pan out for them. Zellweger turned into Landon DuPont for the Everett Silvertips, who got the first overall pick and got an exceptional status player who is lighting up the league as a 15-year-old. So that's just really unfortunate for Kamloops, but they have some work to do in the upcoming years. It's a pretty tough spot. That's why I thought they would trade Finney to at least try and like recoup some of that draft capital, because they don't have their first round pick this year, next year, or the year after that, and that's already after losing DuPont. That's kind of tough to try and get better with, but yeah.
Yeah, and then moving on to the U.S. division, like we were saying, this one, again, is a little bit more of a powerhouse, at least the top three. We'll start with Everett.
I had the pleasure of going to Everett last year during our winter break, so I got to see one of their games last year when they played.
What were you doing in Everett? What was the goal of going to Everett?
Well, I'm a Seattle Kraken fan, as you would know, and last year, well, actually, I should preface this, my family is Red Wings fans. Last year, the Kraken played the Red Wings in Seattle during our reading week, and my parents thought it'd be a great idea if we went. So I had the opportunity to go. I got to see Climate Pledge Arena for the first time, got to visit the lovely city of Seattle. And then while we were there, my brother and I were like, yo, Dad, we should go see a Portland Winterhawks versus Everett Silvertips game, because at the time, Portland had Nate Danielson, who is one of the Wings' top prospects. So we decided to make the trip up there, and thankfully, since that moment, I've become a bandwagon Everett fan, which is extremely lucky for me, because they were pretty good last year. They didn't win it, though I was cheering for them. But then in the offseason, they got the first overall pick. They turned into Landon DuPont.
He's not bad, eh?
No, he's phenomenal. Like, he might be... Like, if you look at the WHL scoring leaders for defensemen, it's like draft year +2, draft year +2, draft year +2, 15-year-old. It's like, okay, yeah, this guy's pretty good. And like like those other guys, like he has another very good defenseman on his team to like compete with like getting power play time, stuff like that, in Terrence Smith. So he's phenomenal. He'll be great in this league for years to come. Like he's like a Cale Makar level talent. I hope he goes to my Seattle Kraken in a couple of years. He's just truly like outstanding.
Yeah, and then anything from their deadline?
They got Vaughn at the deadline, and then maybe their biggest ad was not a trade, but they got Austin Roost back, who was their captain last year. He's a Nashville Predators prospect, and he got loaned back to them as an overager. So they got a free 20-year-old who was like a point per game last year, and like that's just a great ad for them. Like every break kind of seems to be going their way right now, which is just very good for them. Like they got DuPont, they got Roost back, like Mietinen's great. I think they are one of the scariest teams in the WHL. Like everyone on this team is producing. Like draft eligible Carter Bear is one of like the leading scorers in the dub. They had 3 goalies where like for a month straight their like highest goals against average was like a 2.6 goals against average, and they had like their lowest save was like a 9.15. Like that's nuts. Like everyone who plays for them this year is just really good. I think like I would probably bet on them to come out of the West this year, but I think there's one other team that we'll talk about next. I think it would be the biggest bet to upset them in the playoffs.
Talk to me about Spokane, Clint.
I love the Spokane Chiefs. As a Seattle Kraken fan, we obviously have Captain Berkeley Catton there, who is probably the best player in the entire WHL this year. And if he's not, it's his now teammate, Andrew Cristall. Those two have been phenomenal together since they traded for him at the deadline from Kelowna. They played, in their first 3 games, they had a combined 22 points in just 3 games. They absolutely waxed Kelowna for 7 points each in 1 game, which is wicked. And then the next game, they both had 4 points each, which is just they're just outstanding. Whenever you watch them play together, it's like these are 2 dynamic offensive players. Cadden's also very, very responsible in his own end. They have Matisse Preston, who's going to be one of the top picks next year. They are just a very good team, led by those 2 great players up front. And then Shea Van Olm has been one of the best goal scorers in the dub this year. So I think they would be the team that I think if anyone upsets Everett, I think it would be them. They just have such elite offensive dynamic players that I think that might be the one edge that they have over Everett. Everett's just so good as a whole, but I think the true superstars on Spokane could power them by. Go Chiefs!
Okay, go Chiefs, not in a football sense.
Yeah, not in a football sense. Got to make that clear.
Okay, and then the Portland Winterhawks.
They're, again, one of those teams that are kind of in a similar boat to Saskatoon, of they were really good last year. They went all in last year, but then they were still good this year, even after going in all in last year. They got Danielson last year. They lost Wynn in the offseason. But they're still really good somehow. They didn't really make any big splashes. They have one of the best defensemen in the league in Jugnoth, who is also a Kraken prospect, like Caden Price, like Berkeley Catton, like Julius Miatin, who I've already mentioned this podcast. That's enough Kraken propaganda, though. But they're a very solid team. I can see them making a little bit of noise in the playoffs. I wouldn't pick them to beat either Spokane or Everett, but they're still a very solid core.
Yeah, and then you mentioned the Tri-City Americans a little bit earlier with a few of their trades. How did that look for them?
I really like the Alec move for them. They can pair him up with Jackson Smith now, and both those guys are some big boys that are pretty good in their own end. And then definitely Jackson Smith has a little bit more offensive potential. They were really underrated going into the year. They were a young team. They got Gavin Garland, who was probably the runaway rookie of the year favorite outside of DuPont, other than DuPont, who's clearly going to win it. In any other year, Gavin Garland would be a very strong contender for it. He's been great. They traded away Gavin at the deadline, but I think their offense has been pretty good. They were first in the West for a time, I believe. Second in the West for a time, I believe. They were ranked highly in the power rankings going into I remember the World Junior, around that time. They were on the BCHL or WHL player polls. They were regarded very highly. Can't count them out.
Okay, and then the Wenatchee Wild. Did I say that?
Wenatchee.
Yeah, Wenatchee.
I said it.
Said Wenatchee.
Wenatchee.
Wenatchee kind of got screwed last year. They got very unlucky that the Sabres decided to take Zach Benson, who I previously mentioned. If they didn't, they probably would have been one of the best teams in the entire league. They had Savoy, Geeky, and Benson. That is just a wicked core. Savoy went for 3 firsts. I think Geeky went for 3 firsts. I don't even know what they would have got for Benson if they had traded him last year. But if they kept those 3 together, I think they easily would have been the best trio in the entire WHL. So they got kind of unlucky. They don't even have Benson this year, even though he's still eligible to play in the dub this year, which is very unfortunate for them. But I think they did a solid job for Isagai. The return they got for him for being an overager and an import, I think, was pretty solid. I think they did a decent return for Hauser. They're definitely one of those teams that's just kind of tanking and looking for draft position.
Yeah, speaking of tanking, Seattle Thunderbirds. I was high on the Thunderbirds back when they had Thomas Milic. I loved that team. They're in a bit of a rebuild at the moment.
Yeah, definitely a rebuild. They went all in that year. They got Gunther. Definitely they're going to kind of be not that great this year. But Coots has been very solid. He's their new captain. He's going to be drafted in probably the first round this year. Very good two-way player. They got Radim Murtka. Midway through the season, they signed him. I think he's looked pretty solid there. He's put up good point totals. He's another big defenseman from Czechia. And then at the deadline, their real big move was trading away Minio, who I think they got a pretty good return for. They got a first-round pick, pretty solid haul. Can't really complain if you're Seattle. They didn't have the most to sell, and I think they did pretty good in what they did sell. So yeah.
Yeah. And any final thoughts on the dub?
Who's your champion?
It's taking everything in me to not say Everett as a bandwagon Everett fan. But I don't know. I think I'm going to sound like a casual here because I'm talking about Everett and Medicine Hat, but for that reason, I will say the Spokane Chiefs win it. No bias at all, no Kraken bias at all, but I think they just have such elite offensive talent. I could just see like in the playoffs those two just combining for like 2 points a game. That's just really hard to shut down.
All right. And now we had a little bit of false advertising. This is titled a CHL podcast, but we're not omitting the Q, but we're going to touch on it very lightly because who even watches the Q?
We've certainly got less expertise on the
Yeah.
Q
Yeah.
than the other two leagues. Not to say that I had any expertise to offer at all, but Clint, you have a little less on the Q than you do on the other leagues.
Yeah.
Being like from Ontario, it's a lot easier to watch the O and the dub because a lot of the time the O and the Q, those times overlap, and just being from Ontario, I'm going to watch the league in Ontario, so I haven't really watched the most of the Q. And also there's just like less star power in the Q generally. Like aside from like Lafreniere, there haven't been like that many stars since like before like Crosby and them to come in. So there's just a lot less reason to watch the Q if you're just like from Ontario. But I think one team this year that's been phenomenal that I would probably pick to win has been Moncton. Like they've just been truly outstanding. Like Desnoyers, I got to saw a little bit at the top prospect showcase in Ontario here, and he looked very good. He's a lot of bite in his game. He's gonna be a great two-way center in the NHL. They're just very talented. At the deadline, they got Matisse Rousseau to shore up their goaltending. It's hard to bet against them. Their coach didn't lose a single game in Ontario or in Canadian U Sports hockey last year. Didn't lose a single game in the entire season. He's just phenomenal. They're hard to count out. The other team that I'd look out for is Rimouski. In the offseason, they're obviously the Memorial Cup host this year. In the offseason, they got Matthew Cataford, who is one of the best players in the entire Q. And then this deadline, they traded for Eric Smatejko, who had a breakout performance at the World Juniors, which helped like elevate his trade value, and they added him. Those two should be one of the best duos in the Q. They're hard to count out.
A couple of things I want to say on the Q. Moncton, love to cheer on Moncton, especially with Gardner McDougall as their head coach. Gardner McDougall, obviously, a fantastic coach who had lots of success at the U Sports level and internationally for Team Canada, but also just a great human being, like a top 10 human being. And I think his son is involved with that team now, and they've done a really great job running that franchise out in Moncton. So I do hope for the best for them. Rimouski looks really good, like you mentioned, Clint. They're hosting the Memorial Cup this year, so obviously it's an all-in year for them, and I think they've done a really good job so far. Drummondville on the other side in the Western Conference is probably the lead contender to come out of that Western Conference, I would think. They were at the Memorial Cup last year, and you were talking before the show, you and I were talking about how they really didn't have that great of a showing at the Memorial Cup last year. Excuse me, a few guys that are coming back and trying to perhaps exact some revenge on that performance and get back to that stage where they can put on a show once again at a national level. But Drummondville, Moncton, Rimouski, I think are the three teams to watch out of the Q.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think the other, like maybe dark horse here is Rouen or Noranda. They have a very, very good draft eligible in Bill Zona, and he's been phenomenal this year. Most of my Q knowledge stems from draft eligible players. I'm very big into the draft, and they have a couple of good guys here, like Blainville Boisbriand, also has Justin Carbonneau. There's like Emile Guité. There's a bunch of like very solid prospects in this draft class from the Q, better than in some other years. So that's at least a promising sign. I think with a lot of good draft eligibles this year, they'll be like the Q will be a lot more competitive in a couple of years.
Awesome. Okay. Any very early predictions on the Memorial Cup?
This may be like biased, but I feel like Moncton, I think I wouldn't count out Moncton just because they're so well coached. And I think if they make it, then their team you can't count out. But I feel like the winner is going to come from the O or the dub. Just because I think there's just a lot more talent in those those leagues. I remember if you look at like the CHL power rankings, there's a lot of teams that make it from the Q, but if you look at just the win records in general, I did this a while ago, was the last time that I did this, but I was a little annoyed because I thought some OHL teams were being slept on, so I like put all the teams' records, average records, and the WHL had like 75% of teams were like above 500 points percentage, and the O was like 65, and the Q was like 40 at the time. I think there's just like a lot less separation, or a lot more separation in the Q. Like there's the good teams are like a lot better than the bad teams. I think that maybe might make them look a little bit better than they are. I could very well be proven wrong here. I think maybe that is even an argument for why they have a better chance of the Memorial Cup, because like we already mentioned in the OHL, like if you make it there, you're gonna have a gauntlet to make it there. In the dub, there's gonna be a lot of good teams you got to get through. But in the Q, like I think Moncton and Rimouski will, like, Rimouski they've already been locked in as the hosts, and then this year, like, Moncton is a pretty easy ride. Outside of they just need to beat Rimouski, and then that's like Drummondville is also a pretty tough get. But I think it's a lot easier than what some of the OHL teams have to go through. So there's an argument that they'll be more rested, but I would still kind of bank on the OHL. Maybe it's a little bit biased, but
Yeah, really quick on Moncton too. Last time Gardner McDougall was in the Memorial Cup,
they won.
Really weird situation when McDougall took over that St. John team
Yeah.
because they fired the coach after they lost in the playoffs and then hired McDougall to be the coach exclusively for the Memorial Cup.
I was pissed. I was a big Brantford fan that year, just because I liked their team with McTavish and Jordan Donovan, who I went to high school with. So I was like really rooting for that Brantford team, and they lost to the hosts who like wouldn't have even made it. And I was like,
Yeah, that's
up with
tough.
that?
Yeah.
I always get mad at the host teams winning.
Yeah.
That's maybe my little rant, but like I think
No, that's my rant too.
It's such an advantage to be the host team. Like, you know you're going to be there. You can trade a ton at the deadline.
Yeah.
And then also, like, it doesn't even matter what you do in the playoffs. You're going to be there. Like last year, London beat Saginaw in the playoffs. Like when it mattered, they beat them in 6 games. I think London was clearly the better team there, but then they had to go again and play Oshawa in the final, who's another good team. They did kind of drill Oshawa. Like, it wasn't really that tough of a challenge for them, but like Saginaw had the opportunity to just rest up, get healthy before going into the Memorial Cup. So it's always an advantage. That's why I wouldn't count out Rimouski either, but I would still bank on the London Knights. Revenge tour.
That is all the time we have for today. Hopefully you enjoyed this breakdown of the CHL Trade Deadline and our playoff Memorial Cup contenders. Whether you agree or disagree, we invite you to join the discussion on Instagram at Shuttersport Media or Twitter at ShuttersportM. Once again, I'm Katie LeBoutillier, joined by Clint Householder and Dylan Baker. Thank you so much for listening. We will see you in the next one.